IDDE, Module 3. Module 3 reviews dry weather screening and dry and wet weather sampling. It also provides more detail about catchment investigations, including system vulnerability factors, manhole inspections, and source isolation and confirmation. It also touches on illicit discharge removal and confirmatory and ongoing screening. So we're going to talk about dry weather screening and the sampling procedures. So what is dry weather? Dry weather is less than 1/10 of an inch of rainfall occurring in a previous 24-hour period and no significant snowmelt. So this is important to know because you want to make sure when you conduct your dry weather inspections, it's actually dry weather. You don't want to be conducting them after a big significant period of snowmelt, because that snowmelt will be considered stormwater and it won't be dry conditions. So what is dry weather flow? It is a discharge from your storm drain system during dry weather, and it is an indicator of a potential illicit discharge. So the dry weather screening is only required for those outfalls that were ranked as high or low priority. They're not required for problem outfalls, and they're not required for excluded outfalls. They are conducted during dry weather, and they're based on your priority ranking that was completed. Written procedures for outfall and interconnection screening and sampling is required as part of the IDDE program, which needs to include procedures for sample collection, use of field kits, storage and conveyance of samples, including relevant hold times, and field data collection and storage. An example screening and sampling protocol can be found on EPA's website. Refer to the references listed for this module. So these are just the general outfall procedures for screening and for sampling. So you've identified your list of outfalls. You have a list in front of you, and you go to the outfall and you make sure you take a photograph of the outfall. This is very important because you can refer back to it later. And you'd want to I'd recommend taking multiple photos. So take a photo of the outfall itself and then the upstream area, if it's warranted. If you're just documenting the outfall and you don't suspect anything else going on, you can just take a picture of the outfall. But I find different angles and stuff may be helpful for reviewing it back in the office. And a tip for outfall photographing is to make sure you identify what the outfall is in the picture, at least one of the pictures. A lot of outfalls can look very similar when you move from one to the other and you get back, and if they're not linked directly to your inspection, it can become confusing. So you can write the outfall unique identifier on a whiteboard and place it in front of the outfall, take a picture, and then remove it. Take some more pictures if you want some pretty pictures without the whiteboard, and move on from there. And many of you probably are using a digital data collection system, and there's usually an ability to attach a photograph directly to your inspection form, so that is not as critical to identify it because it will be attached right to the inspection, but it could be helpful. So you're at your outfall and then you're going to conduct a visual inspection. Take some time while at the outfall to confirm or collect the following information: unique identifier, receiving water, date of most recent inspection, dimensions, shape, material, and spatial location. For all outfalls, record indicators of potential non-stormwater discharges. So if this is a new outfall, you're going to gather some information about it, such as the location, the material, the condition, the dimension, and then you're going to look for indicators of illicit discharges doing your visual and olfactory screening. So if flow is observed during your dry weather inspection, you're going to collect a grab sample to analyze for various parameters. So if that flow is present during dry weather, you're going to collect a grab sample to analyze. So for outfall sampling, you want to collect the dry weather flow for analysis of ammonia, surfactants, chlorine, conductivity, temperature, salinity, as well as your indicator bacteria. The indicator bacteria is based on your receiving water. If your receiving water is a freshwater water body, you will use E. coli. And if it's a brackish water body, you would use Enterococcus. And you also will be collecting a sample for your pollutant of concern if you're discharging to an impaired water body or a water quality limited water body. Then you'll want to document your inspection. You can do this via a paper form, or if you have a digital data collection system set up, you can input the information that way. And then you'll want to update your outfall inventory and priority ranking based on any results from your screening. So you may come across a submerged outfall when you're doing your inspections, and you don't want to do your screening necessarily at the submerged outfall. You may want to take some notes about it, but you should move upstream to the first accessible structure to take your to do your screening and sampling. So for the portion of the inspection where you're documenting any indicators of illicit discharges, you're looking for visual and olfactory evidence. So you want to use your eyes and your nose to see if there's any indication that there could be something illicit occurring during this dry weather flow. So things you will look at and cover in your inspection is odor. Do you smell anything? What is the color of your discharge? Is it white? Is it green? Is it gray? Does it have a color to it? You look for the turbidity, so the amount of sediment in the water. Is it clear? Is it cloudy? Then you'll look for floatables. Are there any signs of things in the water such as suds or bubbles, sewage, toilet paper? You look for deposits at the outfall. Are there stains? Is there excessive or dead vegetation? And is there any damage to the outfall? And these images, it just goes through some of the severity and different examples of color and turbidity, things you may find. It just kind of gives you a point of reference. These images are taken from the Center for Watershed Protection IDDE manual, which was published in October 2004. This is a very handy manual. If you have not come across it, I'd recommend downloading it. The Center for Watershed Protection IDDE manual can be downloaded at. Here are some more images from the Center for Watershed Protection IDDE manual. These are looking at suds, so different examples of natural versus low severity suds. This shows examples of oil sheens ranging from low to high severity, and the bottom pictures represent a natural versus man-made sheen, which we discussed in Module 1. So you also might see some indicators of bacterial growth, some of being natural, some being from sewage, and then you might see evidence of excessive algal growth. These pictures show just some common things you might see. You might see damage to an outfall. You might see staining that could be a result of deterioration if the structure's brick. You might come across a lot of trash. Technically, trash isn't an illicit discharge that you'll be concerned about for the screening, but you want to make note that you saw that and have it cleaned up. Doing inspections during the winter, so there you can use the evidence and lack of ice to help. If you see ice, it could mean that you had a discharge and then it froze, or your discharge could be recently occurring, which was warm enough so you have ice on one side, and this here you have two outfalls next to each other. One is frozen and one isn't. Potentially you had a discharge. So what type of field equipment do you need? There's a quite extensive list. You can never be too prepared when you go out in the field. So you want to make sure you have your inspection forms, chain of custody forms if you're going to be collecting samples, nitrile gloves to protect your hands. You want to have a cooler with ice if you're going to be transporting samples to the lab. A digital camera. You want to wear your proper PPE, so a safety vest and safety boots at a minimum. And have your sample meters and test kits as applicable. sample containers, things to mark on the containers. You want to have equipment to open manhole structures, and then a different type of other accessories that will help you. So here there are various ways that you can get the answers you need from your samples. There are test kits available for ammonia, surfactants, and chlorine. And then there's meter. You can also use meters for those parameters, as well as conductivity, temperature, and salinity. And then lab parameters, again, are the indicator bacteria and the pollutants of concern for impaired water bodies.
Indicator bacteria include E. coli for freshwater receiving waters, Enterococci for brackish, marine, or saline receiving waters. Samples collected for indicator bacteria and pollutant of concern need to be sent to a laboratory for analysis and analyzed using an EPA or approved method. However, a certified lab is not required.
And there's also the ammonia and chlorine have test strips that can be used as well. A little more simpler to use than the test kits. But so depending on whether you decide to use test kits or meters or the test strips, just make sure you're consistent for your program. You don't want to be switching back and forth because they have different detection limits and accuracy. So you can actually kind of confuse yourself if you test all with with test strips and then you switch to the meter. You might give you a more accurate result. It might throw you off. So I would recommend picking a method and sticking with it for at least for your outfall screening or sampling.
Ammonia. The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol lists ammonia test strips, for example Hawk brand, as example instrumentation for ammonia sampling. Test strips are quick and very easy to use, as well as inexpensive. However, no detection limit is identified and salt water can interfere with results. This method involves dipping a test strip in the sample bottle and reading the resulting concentration. The following short video from the Washington Stormwater Center demonstrates the procedures for use of the ammonia Hawk AquaTrek water quality test strips. Other methods to test for ammonia include the Hawk Ammonia Field Kit color disc, the Hawk Pocket Colorimeter 2 portable single analyte meter, and Comet's Visual Kit for ammonia. Surfactants. The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol lists the MBAS test kit, for example, Chemetrix K9400, generally referred to as Comet's Visual Kit for Detergents, Anionic Surfactants, MBAS, as example instrumentation for surfactant sampling. This method involves snapping the tip of an ampule filled with reagent into a sample cup filled with a sample to be tested. The vacuum in the ampule will pull in the proper volume of sample when the tip is snapped. The ampule is then inverted to mix the sample with the reagent. and the ampule is placed in a color comparator to determine the concentration. The reagent contains chloroform and must be disposed of properly. The following short video from the Chemetrix website demonstrates the Chemet's test procedure.
Chemet's self-filling ampules for visual colorimetric analysis. Designed for maximum simplicity and accuracy, Chemet's brand water analysis kits employ stable reagents vacuum-sealed in self-filling ampules. Test procedures are fast, easy, and accurate. To perform a test using the Chemet's test procedure, fill the sample cup to the 25 milliliter mark with the sample to be tested. Insert the tapered tip of the ampule into one of the depressions in the bottom of the sample cup. Snap the tip of the ampule by pressing the body of the ampule against the side of the cup. The vacuum in the ampule quickly pulls in the correct volume of sample. Mix the contents of the ampule by inverting it several times, allowing the bubble to travel from end to end. Dry the ampule. The sample will react with the reagent to form a color. Reaction times will vary by method. Match the intensity of this color to the standards in the appropriate color comparator to obtain quick quantitative test results for your sample. For lower concentrations, use the round comparator by placing the ampule into the center tube. Direct the top of the comparator up toward a source of light while viewing from the bottom. Rotate the comparator until the color standard below the ampule shows the closest match. Concentration values are printed along the bottom edge of the comparator label. For higher concentrations, hold the flat comparator in a nearly horizontal position while standing directly beneath the source of light. Place the ampule between the color standards, moving it along the comparator until the best color match is found. Designed for field and lab use, most test kits come with everything needed to perform 30 tests. Reagent ampules and kit accessories are also sold separately. Visit our website at www.chemetrix.com to order your test kit or refill today.
Another method to test for surfactants is the Chemetrix SAM single analyte photometer for detergents, anionic surfactants, MBAS, which is a portable meter. Chlorine. The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol lists a field meter, for example, Hawk Pocket Colorimeter 2, as example instrumentation for chlorine sampling. This method involves adding pre-dosed reagents to the sample in a sample cell and inserting the sample cell into a portable single analyte meter to determine a concentration. Another method to test for chlorine is the Hawk Total Chlorine Test Kit, Color Disc, and Hawk Free and Total Chlorine Test Strips. Temperature, salinity, conductivity. The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol lists a temperature, conductivity, salinity meter, for example, the YSI Model 30, as example instrumentation to collect temperature, conductivity, and salinity readings. Since the 2012 draft protocol, the YSI Model 30 has been replaced with the upgraded YSI Pro 30. A properly calibrated meter should be used to record all three parameters directly from the stream or outfall. When flow volume or depth is insufficient to immerse the meter probe, a clean sample bottle may be utilized to collect a sufficient volume of water to immerse the probe. In such instances, meter readings should be taken immediately. The following short video shows the YSI Pro 30 conductivity meter and its features.
Here's the Pro 30 handheld conductivity meter from YSI. It measures salinity, conductivity, specific conductance, TDS, and temperature easily and accurately. So, why is the YSI Pro 30 the ideal solution for your conductivity applications? The Pro 30 has a super stable 4-electrode conductivity sensor designed for long-term use. The sensor is built directly into the cable for extra reliability. It can be cleaned easily with a small conductivity brush, and you'll receive quality data for many, many years. Additionally, the YSI Pro 30 includes an easy cal function that remembers your previous cal settings and walks you through them when it's time to calibrate, an easy-to-read graphic, backlit display, and glow-in-the-dark keypad. 50 data set storage. User-replaceable cables. Our super-stable conductivity cell built into the cable design allows for the most rugged field conditions. Standard cables are available in 1, 4, 10, 20, or 30 meters. YSI products are rugged, accurate, and reliable. And all Pro Series instruments include 3-year instrument warranty, 2-year cable warranty, IP67 waterproof rating, rugged military spec connectors on all meters, 1-meter drop test rating, and a rubber over molded case.
So a few things to consider. You have the same water quality parameters for dry and wet weather sampling. The surfactants field kit creates a hazardous waste, so you need to dispose of that properly. And then indicator bacteria sample bottles, they come pre-filled with a preservative and they're pre-sterilized. And the PVPC can provide some additional guidance on water quality sampling elements. So this table is from the Center for Watershed Protection IDDE manual. It lays out the different types of parameters, how well they are as an indicator for the different types of discharges. So just to review one parameter, so ammonia at the top, it is very well, has very good results for indicating a sewage discharge, but not so good for wastewater. And so you can use this chart to help determine what potentially you could be seeing from the results of your sampling. It's a handy starting point to reference after you receive your results. So when you're in the field and collecting the sample, you want to make sure you fill out the information on your sample bottle, especially if you're sending it to the lab or bringing it back to the office to do the analysis for ammonia, surfactants, or chlorine. And also, if you decide not to do, if you collect the sample and you want to bring it back to the office to do the actual analysis, make sure you got to keep it. Some of them need to be kept cold, and you have a certain holding time, so you want to coordinate that. You want to wear protective gloves when you're filling your sample, so you're not contaminating the sample itself with anything that may be on your hands. Some tests have a higher susceptibility to being contaminated. And when you collect the sample, you want to try as much as possible to get flow directly into the sample bottle, a representative flow, usually from the center of the discharge. And you don't want to, disturb any sediment, or if you're collecting the sample in a catch basin, and you want to avoid as much as possible collecting any of the sump water in your sample, because that could throw off the results. And you want to keep your sample as clean as possible. So you collect a sample to send away for E. coli and any pollutants of concern. You're going to send those to the lab. But you also should collect your sample for the field kit parameters in a sample bottle, and then use that sample to put into the ampules for those test kits.
The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol recommends that bacterial samples be collected first, with care not to disturb sediment materials or collect surface debris or scum as best possible. A separate bottle is used to collect a single water sample from which aliquots will be analyzed for surfactants, ammonia, and total chlorine. Last, a properly calibrated multimeter should be used to record temperature, conductivity, and salinity parameters directly from the stream or outfall. Sample aliquots from the field kit bottle should be analyzed as soon as reasonably possible. When concurrent analyses are not possible, ammonia and chlorine samples should be processed first, followed by surfactants analysis. Based on experience of the PVPC's Chicopee River Source Tracking Project, PVPC recommends surfactant analysis not be done in field and instead be done by lab or in a location with a hooded vent only if E. coli sample is shown to exceed the standard. This will avoid generation of excessive hazardous waste and human exposure to propanol, chloroform, and sulfuric acid. Surfactant samples, however, must be collected in opaque 120 ml bottles and kept on ice in darkness of cooler until analysis, since some surfactant compounds can degrade under ultraviolet light. Maximum holding time is 48 hours.
For lab samples, you want to collect them and place them on ice. You want to fill out any chain of custody forms, and you want to deliver the samples to the lab within the period, the required time, usually as quick as you can get there. And you want to dispose of used test strips and test kit ampules properly.
Some of the reagents used in the field test kits are considered hazardous. As such, all waste from the field test kits should be retained and disposed of according to manufacturer instructions.
And then decontaminate all testing personnel and equipment as required. So the sample bottle, as I mentioned, for the indicator bacteria comes pre-filled with a preservative, and it's pre-sterilized. So you want to make sure that you don't touch the rim or the inside of the bottle. And you don't want to rinse that bottle out before filling it because it has the preservative in it. But for the other parameters, it's helpful to rinse the bottle a couple times with distilled water, then rinse it once with your sample, and then take your actual sample. So interpreting sample results, this table lists the benchmarks for field measurements for select parameters. This part here, when you're doing your sampling result analysis, there's a lot of interpretation that is applied because you're not going to have clear-cut results. They're going to be all over the place, and you might have low of one, high of the other, and you might not have an illicit discharge, but you might be above the benchmark. You got to use some interpretation. It's hard to make a decision on one point also. But these are the guidelines that are in the permit.
The EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol emphasizes that concurrent sampling and analysis of bacteria, surfactant, ammonia, and total chlorine parameters is the most efficient and cost-effective screening method. Where there are elevated levels of bacteria, surfactants, ammonia, and total chlorine in combination, it indicates a high likelihood of upstream illicit connection. However, the EPA New England Bacterial Source Tracking Protocol also warns that evaluation of the data should include a review for potential positive results due to sources other than human wastewater and for false negative results due to chemical reaction or interferences.
So if you find anything illicit, potentially illicit based on your sampling, you're going to have to do catchment investigations to move your way upstream in the system to try to find the source.
Additionally, you will need to inspect all key junction manholes within the MS4, regardless of whether there was evidence of an illicit discharge at the outfall.
So under the catchment investigation portion of your IDDE program, you need to have written systematic procedures to investigate each catchment. And in these procedures, you need to identify, it identifies any maps, historic plans, and records that are available for your reference. This will be helpful in developing the system vulnerability factors for each catchment. The procedures need to include manhole inspection methodology. How are you going to conduct your manhole inspections for key junction manholes, for all your key junction manholes? And they need to include the methodology for both dry and wet weather investigations.
The MS4 general permit states the manhole inspection methodology may either start from the outfall and work up the system, or start from the upper parts of the catchment and work down the system, or be a combination of both practices. Either method must, at a minimum, include an investigation of each key junction manhole within the MS4, even where no evidence of an illicit discharge is observed at the outfall.
And then lastly, these catchment investigations, they establish procedures to isolate and confirm the source of the illicit discharges. So using various methods like sandbagging, dye testing, CCTV inspection. So I mentioned that this thing called a system vulnerability factor, and they are factors that make a catchment more susceptible to an illicit discharge. and they need to be identified for each catchment. And so catchments that have at least one system vulnerability factor or more have to be screened and sampled for wet weather flows.
The MS4 general permit states, where a minimum of one SVF is identified based on previous information or the investigation, a wet weather investigation must be conducted at the associated outfall. All low and high priority outfalls and all key junction manholes need to be screened and sampled, if flowing, during dry weather. All catchments that have a minimum of one SVF identified shall be screened and sampled at the outfall at least once during wet weather. Excluded outfalls do not need to be screened during dry weather, and due to the limited nature of excluded outfalls, they would not be considered excluded if they had a system vulnerability factor associated with their catchment areas. Therefore, wet weather screening for excluded outfalls is not required. These are the system vulnerability factors listed in the permit.
So you would look at your catchments and you would evaluate it based on these characteristics. So you look at your catchment. Are there history of SSOs? Are there instances where the sewer and the storm drain are constructed in the same trench? Do you have crossings in between your sewer and your storm drain where the sewer is at a higher elevation, so it's above your storm drain pipe? Do you have inadequate capacity of your sewer that results in surcharges and backups?
The list of system vulnerability factors includes those that are required and those that are recommended.
So you look at each catchment and then you develop a SVF, or System Vulnerability Factor Inventory. So basically you list your outfall here and it's receiving water, and then these are all of those characteristics, and then you say yes or no whether they're in here, and if you answer yes, then that catchment has to be screened and sampled during wet weather flows.
At the outfall.
So dry weather manhole inspections, that's the starting point for your catchment investigations, and they are systematic and progressive. You want to plan on where you're going and to get the most out of the inspections. You need to observe, sample, and evaluate key junction manholes, and you need to update your mapping and your catchment delineations based on the SVF inventory. So for dry weather manhole inspections, you would inspect the manhole for visual and olfactory evidence similar to your outfall screening. If the flow is present, you would collect a sample for ammonia, chlorine, and surfactants. And then if there's evidence of potential illicit discharges, then you would flag the upstream area for investigation. And then you would conduct key junction manhole inspections until a suspected illicit discharge is isolated to a pipe segment between two manholes. And if no evidence of an illicit discharge is found, the catchment investigation is considered complete once the junction manholes have been sampled. So junction manholes are a structure with two or more inlets receiving water from more than one MS4 alignment. So you have two inverts in from different alignments of your MS4. That's considered a junction manhole. But then you have these things called key junction manholes, which are special, and they're junction structures that represent one or more junction manholes that can be used to rule out tributary areas of the system during investigation. So wet weather screening, that occurs for all catchments that have more than one system vulnerability factor. During a storm event, you conduct these wet weather inspections, sampling during a storm event where you have a discharge from storm sewer system. There's no prescribed size of a storm. It could be a small storm, it could be a large storm, any storm event that produces a discharge. EPA strongly recommends that they're done during the spring when you have higher groundwater levels, and they also recommend that the wet weather sampling should not occur during your first flush. So right when the storm starts, you have that first flush of pollutants, and that is usually an area of concern. You want to, when you're treating that stormwater, you want to treat that first flush because it has a high concentration of pollutants. And for this purpose, you're not so concerned. You don't want to find, you're not looking for the analysis of that first flush. You're looking for the effect that this rain event has on your systems. So the purpose of the wet weather sampling is to determine if an illicit discharge is due to wet weather induced high flows in the sewer or high groundwater in areas served by septic systems. So it's a little bit different. And it's really hard to coordinate wet weather events. They usually don't occur when they are most amenable. It's not usually during business hours between 7 and 3. They take a lot of coordination to get it there at the right time. And you're not going to have outfalls flowing all at the same time. Some outfalls take a long time before any flow starts to come. So this is definitely a puzzle to figure out the timing of a wet weather sampling.
As a clarification, the MS4 general permit does not require a minimum rainfall event prior to wet weather screening. However, permittees may incorporate provisions that assist in targeting such discharges, including avoiding sampling during the initial period of discharge, first flush, and/or identifying minimum storm event intensities likely to trigger sanitary sewer interconnections.
So you took a sample, wet weather sample, what's next? So if the sampling indicates that there's a potential illicit discharge, additional source sampling and is required and confirmation is needed. If the sampling does not indicate a potential illicit discharge and there's no indications during a manhole inspection, then the catchment investigation is considered complete. So here are some examples of source isolation and confirmation. So sandbagging, this is a useful tool for trying to trap continuous or intermittent flows. So essentially you sandbag or block, dam off the inlets of your manhole. And you want to be careful though that you only do this during a forecasted dry period. You don't want to be causing flooding as a result of trying to track down your illicit discharge. And you don't want the sandbags to be flushed down in your system and cause issues for you. Your sandbags are left in place for about 2 days, 48 hours or less, and then during dry weather, as I mentioned. This method is a little bit time consuming because it requires multiple trips to the same structure and it has limited results. But essentially what you're trying to do is just trap, if you have an intermittent or a continuous flow that you can't see while you're there, you put the sandbags in, it traps it, and then you can collect a sample of the fluid coming in and analyze it. So smoke testing, you introduce smoke into your storm drain and you look to see where it comes out. Is it coming out of sewer vents? Is it coming out of sewer manholes? Is it coming out of the ground? You look for evidence of where the smoke is coming. You can use smoke bombs or blowers, liquid smoke that are, both need to be connected to a blower. And then you need to plug and kind of isolate the system that you are trying to smoke test. You need to have a concentrated area with the concentrated amount of smoke. So you can plug your inlets with sewer plugs or sandbags, or some people use beach balls. And you want to make sure you notify the residents so that when their smoke alarm goes off in their house, that they're not scared or don't know what to do, come running out. And also notify police and fire. So dye testing, you introduce dye into the plumbing fixtures. Look for the dye coming out at the outfall. You're looking for the presence of the dye. You might do this on either sewer or storm drain. They both can be dye tested and help you gather information about the system and how they're connected. You need sufficient amounts of water to flush the dye, and you also should notify residents and businesses, fire and police, so they're not alarmed when they see bright color dye in a water body. Dye testing is relatively quick, effective, and inexpensive, especially if you have a suspected area that you're testing. So other methods that you can use is CCTV video inspections. So you put a camera, remotely controlled camera into the storm drain system, and you run it down. You're looking for cross connections or areas that could be contributing illicit discharge. It's very effective, but it's also very costly and time consuming. If you don't have access to a CCTV truck in your community, you probably have to hire it out. So optical brightener monitoring, this you're looking for fluorescent dyes and detergents that could be from laundry detergent. They put optical brighteners in the laundry detergent to make your whites whiter. So you can set up a trap where you take cotton that's wrapped in a wire cage and you hang it, secure it into your structure, and then you wait a while, and then you come back and you put the optical brightening trap under a UV light and you look for evidence of optical brighteners. Or you can use a handheld fluorometer, which is more quantitative but also costs more. So then a newer up-and-coming approach is using IDDE canines. So they're dogs that are trained in detecting illicit discharges from human-related sewage. It's not a widespread practice, but it is cost-effective, and it is a tool that can supplement your traditional and conventional methods. So once a source of an illicit discharge is identified, removal is necessary. You need to eliminate the discharge within 60 days of identification, or you need to establish a schedule on how you're going to remove that illicit discharge. This is where you rely on your legal authority that you put in place, and then you need to include this in your annual report. There's specific requirements about the illicit discharge that was removed, location, date, how did you discover that this was an illicit discharge, how much flow did you remove, specifics like that. And then you'll have to confirm that the illicit discharge was removed, and this needs to be conducted during dry weather unless you had a system vulnerability factor identified in that catchment, and then you'll need to do both dry and wet weather screening. So it's conducted within 1 year of the removal of your identified illicit discharge, and you're looking, if there's evidence of an illicit discharge, it requires additional investigation. And then you need to do ongoing screening. Screen once every 5 years and conduct dry weather and wet weather as required.
Ongoing screening is to be completed after catchment investigations and illicit discharge removal and confirmation are completed, at which point outfalls and interconnections are reprioritized and a schedule developed for ongoing screening, which is required once every 5 years. In summary, the following are links to resources referenced in Module 3.